Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Fan Art Friday. This week I'm working on a drawing of Nathan Drake from Uncharted, and he has actually been suggested loads of times in the recent comments. I guess that's because he is such an iconic character, so I wanted to make sure I worked on it for this week's video. I started off the initial outlines with a sepia coloured Copic Marker pen. It's 0.05mm, so it gave me that extra control. Instead of going along with realistic curved lines, I tried to make the outlines of his face a bit more blocky and kind of almost more cartoonish. I wanted to sharpen up some of the edges and see what that would do to the end result. So it was a bit of a risk, but I really wanted to try. And as always, I was focusing the darkest outlines to the underside of his jaw, to the undersides of some parts of the hair, and just to help direct where I wanted to add the shading later on. Once I finished the outlines, it was time to move on to the colouring, and as usual for the colouring I used Copic Markers, starting off by adding the base layer of the skin tones with a pinkish white. Adding some light colouring, but also getting an idea of where I wanted to place the darker colouring later on. Once I was finished with the pinkish white, I then used pale grape to add the next layer of colouring, to add the darker shading to the underside of his eyebrows, alongside the edge of his nose and the underside of that, and to add some darker shading to his cheek. When I was happy with how that was looking, I then used a pale heath marker to help blend between the coloured areas and the white areas, just to help smooth the transition between them. I really love using the pale heath marker for the colour it gives, and it really adds a nice warm tone to skin tones. I highly recommend trying it out if you get a chance. It's a really nice marker to use, and I've been using it in so many of my drawings recently. Finally, as a last touch for the skin tones, I used a light grape marker to add the darkest shading. So I was using this to add the dark shading to his cheek, adding some really dark shading to the underside of his nose, to his eyes, and underneath his mouth. I also decided to use Cool Grey 1, 3 and 5 to add some extra shading to his skin tones, especially to his cheek, and to help add a real contrast between the shaded and the highlighted areas of the skin. For his eye colour, I used Sky Blue and Frost Blue, and to add the shading to the white of his eyes, I used a Cool Grey 1, also using a Cool Grey 5 to add some extra shading around that area. For the colouring of his lips, I started by using a blush Copic marker, and then after that I added layers of pale grape and light grape, and then to add some texture I used a Uni-ball Signo broad pigment ink white pen to add some highlighting. I also used this pen to add a highlight to his nose and the highlights to his eyes. I also decided that in this drawing I wanted to use some Prismacolor pencils, so I decided to use a black pencil to add his facial hair. I also used it to add some dirt marks around his skin and to add extra detail to his eyelashes. I followed the same process for the skin tones on his neck, starting with the pinkish white and then moving on to the pale grape and the pale heath, and then lastly to add the darkest areas I used a light grape, and then used the cool greys to add the darkest shading, especially around the back of his neck. For the brown section of his clothing I used maroon and light walnut, making sure to leave some highlighted areas, and then for the grey section of his clothing I used Cool Grey 5. I also made use of the Prismacolor pencils to add some extra details to that area, like the threads along the edges, and to add some parallel lines going across to add some texture. Once I'd finished adding the details to his face and his clothing, it was time to move on to the next part, and that was his hair. And for that I used a maroon Copic marker to add the base layer of colouring. To add some details like texture and a bit of depth, especially to the top of the hair, I used a mixture of Cool Grey 5 and Cool Grey 7. And I decided to add the rest of the details to the hair with Prismacolor pencils, so I started by using the black Prismacolor pencil to add all the shaded areas, and then I used the white Prismacolor pencil to add all of the highlighted sections, especially on the side of his head. I think this effect really worked well, and I definitely want to try this again in future videos. Mixing the Prismacolor pencils with the Copics works quite well sometimes. I decided to use a Cool Grey 7 to add a really dark background, and then I used the highlighter pen to add highlight going all the way around him, just to make him stand out from this panel. And lastly, as a final touch, I wanted to add some blood to the cut that he's got on his forehead and his nose, so for that I used a crimson marker and then used a blush marker to kind of blend it outwards. And after all that I used a black Copic multiliner to add a thick black border going all the way around the panel in the background. and after that the drawing was completed, and overall it took about 3 hours to complete. And I had a lot of fun working on it. It's one that's been suggested so many times, so I thought it was about time I tried. I really hope you like it, and I really hope it ended up looking like a cartoonized version of Nathan Drake. So please let me know what you think of this drawing in the comments below. If you enjoy videos like this, then make sure to subscribe, and any likes or shares are hugely appreciated and it always means so much to me. If you want to follow me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram and follow along with the progress photos throughout the week, then be sure to check out the links in the description box below. And once again, thank you so much for supporting this channel. It means so much to me and I can't wait to work on the next drawing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all soon.